In 1943, Mitsubishi Zero soars through the Pacific skies with the arrogance of those who have dominated for 2 years. Its pilots expect the usual, that American fighters will turn and flee. But something. This time, the Americans climb decisively toward them. The battle begins. The Zeros open fire first. Tracers strike the fuselages, but the bullets from their 20mm cannons, once lethal, seem to bounce off the enemy's armored wings. Something unheard of until that day. Heavy armor should make those fighters slow. Confident Japanese pilots expect to outmaneuver them easily. But once again, they are mistaken. These planes surge upward in a near vertical climb, powered by 2,000 horsepower engines, gaining altitude at a speed impossible for the lightweight Zeros. The Americans counterattack. Each fighter unleashes 6 .50 caliber machine guns, unleashing a deadly rain that tears through Japanese formations with terrifying precision. The Grumman F6F Hellcat has arrived in the Pacific, and for the first time, the balance of power shifts in the air. In the early 1940s, while Nazi bombers devastated London and Japanese planes ravaged Chinese cities, American commanders lived in fear of the possibility that those same predators would reach the shores of the United States. The best naval fighter they had at the time was the Brewster F-2, a Buffalo, capable of reaching 515 kilometers per hour and armed with 12.7mm machine guns. Though it could fight, it was clear that in a direct confrontation, it stood no chance against Axis fighters. That day of facing them would come soon. On the morning of December 7, 1941, hundreds of Japanese planes descended on the naval base at Pearl Harbor. With bomb bays open, explosions tore through ships and airfields indiscriminately. In less than 2 hours, battleships burned in flames. The American air fleet was reduced to rubble, and more than 2,000 lives were lost. For the first time, the United States felt the full fury of Japanese air power. And at the center of that destruction was the Mitsubishi Zero, the most advanced and feared Japanese fighter. In its early years, the Zero achieved a kill ratio of 12-1, crowning itself the undisputed king of the Pacific. Not only did it defeat American fighters, it humiliated them. Some believe that even Hitler's Luftwaffe had nothing comparable. However, America had no choice but to face these Japanese pilots with the resources available and hope for a miracle. Hours after Pearl Harbor, Zeros attacked the Philippines, proving they could strike any American position in the region. Thanks to their combat range exceeding 800 kilometers, even the best American planes were defenseless. Formations of P-40 Warhawks and B-17s were swept aside with ease. Many American pilots never saw the Zeros coming, and when they did, it was already too late. The skies belonged to Japan. By May 1942, the Philippines had fallen to Japanese hands, dealing a humiliating early defeat to the United States. Later, a Japanese officer would acknowledge that the Zeros were the key to success in that campaign, comparing them to pistons driving an unstoppable locomotive. For American commanders, it was clear their current planes were not enough. They urgently needed a new air defender. Fortunately, even before the war began, the Navy was already planning a revolutionary new fighter, a plane capable of exceeding 640 kilometers per hour, armed with devastating firepower, and durable for long battles over oceans. The Navy turned to the Vought Company, which relied on the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Wasp with 2,000 horsepower, creating the X-4U-1 Corsair prototype, the first American naval aircraft to exceed 640 kilometers per hour. Though the Corsair broke speed and power records, it had a serious flaw. It was nearly impossible to land on an aircraft carrier. Its long nose blinded pilots during approach. Its landing gear was unstable, and its wings caused dangerous loss of control during landing. Therefore, while engineers worked day and night to perfect the Corsair, American pilots had to hold out with what they had. The responsibility of stopping the Japanese fell on the Grumman F4F Wildcat. A decent fighter, but one that could never outmatch the Zero, while American pilots resisted with the limited Grumman F4F Wildcat. They knew they were only buying time. The reality was harsh. They faced the agile Mitsubishi Zero, an enemy superior in speed, maneuverability, and firepower. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch spent sleepless nights consumed by frustration and helplessness, devising strategies at an improvised table, arranging matchsticks to simulate squadrons in the sky, recreating aerial battles to discover a tactic that would allow them to survive. Finally, in the middle of one night, inspiration struck like a revelation. A maneuver capable of compensating for the Wildcats' technical inferiority, giving them at least a chance to defend against the Zero's lightning attacks. He would soon have a real opportunity to test it. The awaited moment came in June 1942. In the heat of the decisive Battle of Midway, the skies had become a stage for fierce encounters, with planes roaring among the clouds in deadly combat. Thatch led a formation of 4 Wildcats when a Japanese Zero appeared from behind, positioning itself on the tail of his wingman, with clear intent to shoot him down. Instead of breaking formation and losing cohesion, Thatch ordered the immediate execution of his new maneuver, later named the Thatch Weave. The Wildcats began crisscrossing with absolute precision, confusing the Japanese pilot, who was drawn into the heart of a deadly trap. Just as the Zero prepared its final attack, Thatch emerged from an unexpected angle, unleashing a burst that shattered the Japanese plane in mid-flight. The devastating effectiveness of this tactic deeply shocked the experienced Japanese pilots. Veterans like the legendary Saburo Sakai later described how that maneuver disrupted their squadrons. For the first time, Wildcats were no longer easy prey, but cunning predators. The Thatch Weave was quickly adopted as a standard combat tactic across the Navy, giving American pilots a real chance to survive, while awaiting the plane that would definitively change the rules of aerial combat in the Pacific. Though it was only temporary relief, that maneuver represented America's adaptability against Japan's technical superiority. Finally, by late 1942, the long-awaited moment arrived. The Corsair, the fighter the Navy had carefully designed before the war, was declared combat ready, but the definitive victory would still have to wait. Despite its dazzling speed and destructive power, the Corsair had a serious flaw. Its design made it nearly impossible to land safely on an aircraft carrier's deck. The plane's long nose severely hindered visibility during landing, while its landing gear and wings caused terrifying loss of control. Faced with these issues, the Corsair was temporarily restricted to land-based operations, while engineers worked tirelessly to fix its flaws. But even operating from land, the plane quickly proved its worth. Once deployed in combat, the Corsair struck absolute terror into Japanese ranks. Armed with 6 devastating 50 caliber machine guns, each capable of firing 400 rounds per minute, it could shred any enemy fighter in seconds. Moreover, loaded with up to 8 high-speed rockets, it could quickly reduce enemy ground positions. For the first time since the war began, the Zero had found a rival that could openly challenge it. and surpass it with ease. Even so, the Navy knew that to win this war, they needed more than brute force. They needed a versatile plane, reliable and easy to handle in the most extreme conditions. Once again, the Grumman Company was called upon to find that solution. Grumman, aware that pilots needed more than just speed and power, decided to completely redesign the Wildcat, using the same Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine as the Corsair. Pacific veteran pilots were invited to the factories, contributing their direct combat experience to create an indestructible plane and easy to repair under enemy fire. Pilots demanded a robust landing gear, capable of withstanding violent carrier landings, a cockpit that provided clear forward visibility during intense combat, and a structure so simple that any mechanic could repair it in minutes after a battle. The result was an exceptional aircraft that would mark an era and whose name echoes in history: the Grumman F6F Hellcat. The new Hellcat combined the best possible qualities: tougher than the Zero, more maneuverable and easier to fly than the Corsair, and so compact that its folding wings allowed easy storage on the tight deck of any aircraft carrier. Its intuitive controls were so easy to handle that Grumman proudly claimed any young pilot with just 200 hours of flight time could fly it successfully. When the Hellcat made its first test flights, everyone immediately knew this plane would be decisive in turning the tide in the Pacific. At last, the United States had a naval fighter capable of facing Japanese air supremacy on equal terms. The Hellcat quickly became a symbol of American air power and a living hope for thousands of pilots. On September 1, 1943, the day finally arrived. From the deck of the USS Independence, two Navy pilots, Lieutenant Dick Loesch and Ensign A. Dublin, took off aboard the brand new Hellcats for their first real combat mission. Their target was a Japanese aircraft, Kawanishi H-8K Emily, a massive enemy patrol seaplane. As soon as the Hellcats left the deck, roaring with the power of their double Wasp engines, it was clear that Japanese air supremacy was about to end. Both fighters advanced like relentless predators on the enemy plane, closing the distance quickly with absolute precision. Tracer bullets lit up the sky as the Hellcat's machine guns unleashed devastating bursts on the seaplane. In seconds, the Japanese plane erupted in flames, officially marking the first aerial victory of the F6F Hellcat and heralding a new era of American dominance over the Pacific skies. 2 months later, in November 1943, Hellcats returned to action over the Gilbert Islands in the fierce American offensive against the island of Tarawa. The Japanese pilots they faced were not novices. They were seasoned veterans flying the fearsome Mitsubishi Zero, accustomed to dominating every aerial encounter with ease. But this time, something had changed radically. The Japanese Type 97 machine guns, which had previously shredded American planes like toys, now barely scratched the Hellcat's reinforced armor. Even less experienced American pilots seemed like seasoned warriors, maneuvering with skill and demolishing Japanese formations with almost incomprehensible ease. When the battle ended, the tally was staggering: 30 Zeros shot down against only 1 Hellcat lost. From that moment, the F6F Hellcat quickly became the backbone of American naval air power. As U.S. forces advanced relentlessly across the Pacific, conquering island after island, the Hellcat was always there, protecting every fleet and securing every aerial victory. But its fame soon crossed the ocean. More than 1,200 Hellcats were sent to Great Britain, where Royal Navy pilots They were sent to fight over Norway and the Mediterranean. There, they faced the best of the Luftwaffe, veterans hardened in the Blitz, and on the relentless Eastern Front, under anti-aircraft fire that would have destroyed any other aircraft. The Hellcats returned time and again damaged, but riddled with dozens of bullet holes, yet miraculously intact, leaving even the most experienced pilots in awe. One of those British pilots described with admiration and surprise how he returned from a mission in his Hellcat, completely perforated. It had more holes than fuselage. He could feel more wind passing through the plane than around it. This extraordinary resilience became a symbol of American robustness. But in the Pacific, the air war was far from over. The Japanese, desperate in the face of the Hellcat's superiority, began launching nighttime attacks with torpedo bombers to avoid direct confrontation. The American response was swift. They formed night fighter teams known as bat teams, consisting of 2 Hellcats escorting a radar-equipped TBF Avenger. And it was the legendary Edward "Butch" O'Hare who volunteered to lead the first of these dangerous missions. On the dark night of November 26, 1943, O'Hare took off from the deck of the USS Enterprise, aboard his Hellcat, escorted by another pilot and a radar-equipped Avenger. Navigating almost blindly over a pitch-black ocean, the group desperately searched for Japanese bombers. After minutes of absolute tension, the radar finally detected nearby enemy activity. Before attacking, O'Hare requested confirmation by radio to visually identify the enemy, but something went terribly wrong. While searching in vain ahead, a Japanese bomber suddenly appeared behind O'Hare, unleashing a chaotic exchange of fire. In the midst of that chaos, the lights of O'Hare's Hellcat suddenly went out, and the plane vanished without a trace into the ocean's darkness. The mission ended tragically, with the loss of one of America's finest pilots. The search for O'Hare yielded no results, leaving a bitter reminder of the vulnerability of even the greatest warriors. With this loss, the certainty seemed to waver that the Hellcat would lead the United States to an absolute and undisputed victory in the Pacific. But the Japanese were not yet defeated, and in a final desperate attempt to regain air superiority, they deployed their own answer to the Hellcat, the new and formidable Kawanishi N-1K Shiden. This aircraft, initially designed as a floatplane, was converted into a land-based fighter that immediately surprised the Americans with its resistance to fire and its advanced auto flaps, capable of providing lethal maneuverability in close combat. The Shiden seemed invincible. American pilots watched in frustration as .50 caliber bullets bounced off its reinforced armor, while these Japanese fighters continued attacking without faltering. Worse still, an elite unit, the legendary 343rd Kakutai, under the command of the famous Minoru Genda, adopted the Shiden Kai, an even more advanced version of the aircraft, and began hunting Hellcats mercilessly. In an epic battle, the Shiden Kais charged directly against over 300 American aircraft, penetrating formations of Hellcats, Corsairs, and Avengers, shooting down multiple aircraft, while suffering minimal losses. For the first time, American technological dominance seems to be questioned, causing many pilots to fear that the hard-won advantage was slowly slipping from their hands. But behind these apparent Japanese triumphs, the reality was far bleaker. Japan could barely keep its new and sophisticated fighters operational. The N-1K Shiden, with its advanced Homari engine, complex and difficult to manufacture, suffered constant failures due to Japan's crumbling industry, devastated by continuous Allied bombings. Of the barely 1,500 fighters produced, many never reached the front, destroyed by American attacks before they could even take off. Meanwhile, in the United States, factories worked day and night, producing thousands of Hellcats, flooding the Pacific carriers with new aircraft ready for combat. The American industrial machine was unstoppable, creating an insurmountable gap between the two air forces. The N-1K, despite its bravery and effectiveness in close combat, quickly showed its limitations at high altitudes, unable to effectively intercept B-29 Superfortress bombers. With Japan's industry collapsing rapidly, the summer of 1944 arrived. Desperate, the Japanese once again deployed their aging Zeros, now clearly outmatched. In the pivotal battle of the Philippine Sea, more than 20 aircraft carriers launched over 1,300 American aircraft into the air, many of them Hellcats equipped with advanced radar technology. During this decisive battle, the figure of Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu emerged, a Hellcat pilot whose mission seemed doomed to failure from the start. Shortly after takeoff, his aircraft suffered a critical supercharger failure, significantly reducing its speed and maneuverability. However, Vrasiu did not retreat. With absolute determination, he launched into combat alone against a large formation of enemy bombers. In just 8 minutes, Vrasiu shot down 6 Japanese aircraft, executing lightning-fast attacks lasting mere seconds per target. His heroic performance perfectly symbolized the Hellcat supremacy over the weakened Japanese Zeros. When the battle concluded, Japan had lost over 500 aircraft, 90% of its carrier-based air force, while American losses were minimal, with fewer than 24 Hellcats shot down. This defeat marked the definitive end of Japanese air power in the Pacific, depriving Japan of the ability to launch new large-scale air offensives. For the remainder of the war, American air superiority, led by the formidable Hellcats, was now absolute and overwhelming. By late 1944, the American air fleet wove an impenetrable net over the Pacific, known as the Great Blue Blanket, composed primarily of Hellcat formations that neutralized any Japanese counterattack attempts. But Japan, refusing to accept its inevitable defeat, planned one final desperate offensive in the Philippines. In October of that year, the largest naval battle ever witnessed unfolded, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Japan committed all its remaining naval and air resources to this fight, in a desperate effort to halt the unstoppable Allied advance. But this time, the American numerical and technological superiority was overwhelming. The United States had trained over 17,000 pilots since the war began, while Japan barely reached 5,000, most of whom lacked real combat experience. In this desperation, Japan resorted to a drastic measure: kamikaze attacks. Japanese planes loaded with explosives launched into suicide missions directly against American carriers, aiming to destroy their decks before the Hellcats could take off. The initial attacks were devastating. The escort carriers USS Lo and USS Suwannee suffered severe damage when kamikazes crashed into their decks, causing fires and chain explosions that temporarily paralyzed their air operations. However, the USS Lo suffered the worst fate. A kamikaze pierced its deck, causing massive internal explosions that quickly consumed the entire ship, sending it to the ocean floor with much of its crew and aircraft. But even these suicide attacks could not stop the determination of the Hellcat pilots. Even under intense enemy fire, the fighters took off from damaged decks, bravely ascending into combat. Once in the air, they systematically tore apart the kamikaze formations before they could cause further damage to the Allied fleet. This swift and ferocious response halted the Japanese suicide attacks in their tracks, securing a decisive victory for the U.S. Navy at Leyte, the last great naval battle of World War II. The Hellcat's effectiveness had once again proven itself with absolute conviction, confirming its central role in the victorious outcome of the conflict. But the war was not over. In the final months of the conflict, in 1945, the Hellcat continued to carry out critical missions to secure the final victory. During a critical mission, to neutralize enemy airfields used as bases for kamikaze attacks, pilot Don McCampbell led a daring raid against a remote enemy island. After successfully destroying the runway and scattering enemy defenses with rockets, he observed a group of enemy bombers suddenly emerging on the horizon, flying low over the sea, ready to attack his squadron. With no time to react, McCampbell quickly maneuvered his Hellcat, opening fire immediately on the lead enemy bomber. With deadly precision, McCampbell shot down the first bomber in seconds. But as he attempted to intercept the others, a voice on the radio urgently warned him, "Don, get out of there, they're firing at you from the ground." Immediately afterward, enemy anti-aircraft batteries opened fire on his position. Ignoring the danger, McCampbell continued his attack, shooting down 2 more bombers, before being forced to swiftly escape the area. That heroic act marked one of the final offensive missions led by Hellcats during the war. Just weeks later, Japan finally announced its surrender. The relentless Grumman F6F Hellcat had fulfilled its destiny, securing the American victory in the most devastating war in history, with World War II finally concluded in September of 1945. The Grumman F6F Hellcat gradually stepped back from the prominence it had held during the Pacific's most decisive battles. Throughout its extraordinary career, the Hellcat rightfully earned its reputation as one of the most lethal and efficient fighters ever built. During the conflict, this aircraft achieved an impressive record. Over 75% of all air victories claimed by the U.S. Navy were credited to Hellcat pilots. In total, over 66,000 combat missions were flown by these fighters, destroying thousands of enemy aircraft with remarkably low losses. Only 270 Hellcats were shot down in direct engagements with enemy aircraft. This forever cemented its legacy as the great air victor of the Pacific War. However, the arrival of the jet age brought an end to the prominence of piston engine fighters. The Hellcat began to be quickly phased out as new technologies took center stage, and little by little, it faded from frontline service. Even so, several examples found unexpected new missions during the early years of the Cold War. During the Korean War, some Hellcats were adapted as remotely controlled drones, used in suicide attacks against heavily fortified enemy targets. These unmanned aircraft pioneered a strategy that would become commonplace decades later, demonstrating a versatility few could have imagined when the Hellcat ruled the Pacific skies. Other aircraft met an even more peculiar fate. In the historic nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll, several of these machines were sent directly into radioactive clouds formed after atomic explosions. Equipped with specialized measuring instruments and remote control cameras, these modified fighters bravely ventured into deadly environments to collect vital data that allowed the United States to assess the devastating effects of nuclear weapons on aircraft and military materials. In those missions, the Hellcat once again demonstrated its exceptional robustness, enduring extreme and hazardous conditions that would have destroyed less prepared aircraft. Today, though decades have passed since those days of glory and tragedy over the Pacific Ocean, a few operational examples of the Grumman F6F Hellcat still remain, carefully preserved in museums and airshows, primarily in the United States and the United Kingdom. These examples are no longer destined for combat. Now, they serve a more symbolic mission, but equally powerful, to remind future generations of the heroic role played by the pilots and the machines that fought in the Pacific skies. For those who observe them, these aircraft represent courage, determination, and human ingenuity pushed to its absolute limits. Ultimately, the story of the F6F Hellcat is not just the story of an aircraft. It is the story of men who faced extraordinary challenges, who overcame initial despair to prevail over enemies that seemed invincible. It is the chronicle of engineers and pilots who worked together with relentless discipline and unprecedented bravery, creating a machine capable of changing the course of history. The Hellcat does not only symbolize a military victory, but also a moral and psychological triumph. It proved that no adversity is too great when there is the resolute will to confront it. When we see the robust and proud silhouettes of these aircraft today, still intact after more than 80 years, we do not merely observe metal objects or simple relics of the past. We see a living testament to the triumph of human resilience. Every rivet, every propeller blade, every weathered panel silently narrates an epic story of sacrifice, innovation, and determination. In the end, the legend of the Grumman F6F Hellcat endures because it embodies something profoundly human: the ability to confront the deepest fears, adapt in the face of impossible challenges, and triumph over enemies that once seemed insurmountable. Thus concludes the story of the aircraft that dominated the Pacific skies, securing victory for the Allies in World War II. An aircraft born amidst desperation, developed under the most urgent circumstances, and ultimately became the key that forever changed the fate of the world. Today, as we look to the sky, we can imagine those days when the roar of the Hellcats announced hope for some, terror for others, but absolute respect for all who witnessed their flight.